Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler book review for The Wolf of Oren-Yaro. This is the first book in a fantasy trilogy, and it's one that I think is both underhyped and underrated. So by that I mean literally I saw the Goodreads average rating for this book and I personally think that it should be higher, and then also I don't see a ton of people talking about it. I think the majority of people who pick it up enjoy it but maybe don't absolutely love it, and then I've seen that the sequels, the rating goes up significantly and a lot of people say it just improves from where we start in this first book. It has a lot to offer that I think is going to be very appealing to a lot of different people, so I really want more people to check this one out. It's not as intimidating or intense as something like Malazan Book of the Fallen or Stormlight Archive, but it's also, I would say, got more world building and is a little bit higher fantasy than something like the Dresden Files. It's just a really nice, cozy in-between, and that's part of what I think makes it very appealing to a lot of fantasy fans, or the potential to sound appealing, I should say. But either way, starting with the setup for the story, if you're very unfamiliar, because this isn't particularly well known, it's not extremely popular, we follow a woman who is an adult, so it's not a coming of age story. She's not a teenager. She's not somebody who like grew up on a rural farm, and then it's not that at all. So it's really a cool perspective to see the world from. She's around 26 years old. She is married. She has a son. She is the ruler of this particular land, but she has a very fragile hold on the land as a result of a few different things that are somewhat mysterious in nature based off of how the book starts. I think it's got a very gripping beginning. I instantly was hooked. But we follow this woman who is leading this land, and 5 years ago, her husband left. She hasn't really communicated with him since then, but their marriage is very important to maintain peace. You kind of discover more about why as the story progresses. They also have a son together, so she's very conflicted because she's somebody who wants so badly to hold the peace, but at the same time, she also is considering her son. She also has to constantly consider, would it be best if my husband and I never really reconciled, or would it be better if we did? And she kind of has to weigh the pros and cons. She has a lot of different warlords who are constantly butting heads, talking in her ear, giving her their insight, and she's got to decide for herself what she needs to do. This opportunity presents itself basically at the beginning of the book, and that's sort of the plot you're set up with. Is she has a chance to talk to this husband. You don't know exactly why he left. You know that she killed someone. That's basically page one. You know she killed someone and then he left, and you don't really know all the details. And then she has the opportunity to speak with him again, but she doesn't know if she's walking into a trap. She doesn't know if he potentially is setting up this trap, if someone else is setting up this trap. She's wondering if he's a puppet working for someone else. She just doesn't know what's going on. And so I think that right away there's very high stakes because you're also wondering, is she walking into a trap or what? I don't know. And very quickly, as a result of her being a mother, even if she doesn't necessarily think of her husband as, oh my gosh, I loved this man so much, she also recognizes it's the father of her son, and so she has this very strong emotional connection to him in that way. So I think it's really cool because we don't see a lot of parents as the main characters in our fantasy story, and we don't often see them having to consider not just themselves and their feelings, but the feelings of their children. But for those of you who maybe don't love child characters in your fantasy, because I know it's a lot of us, I wouldn't say that the child is necessarily that much in the book. I think it's in the character's head, and we are in her head the entire time. It's first person narration, just from her point of view, which is part of why I think that this book, even though, like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of pretty intense world building going on, I still think it's rather accessible as a result of it being first person. Also, the writing itself, I think, flows very nicely. I don't think it's too simplistic, but it's also not something you're constantly having to decipher. It flows quite nicely, I think. Because this book isn't talked about all that much, I didn't really know what I was getting into, so I had this idea of what the plot was, but after a little bit of the beginning, once I was like, okay, so like that's the plot, but what are we doing now? And there was a little moment of time where it felt like it was going to meander and just be aimless. And I don't want to give away too much because I think the direction the book goes in is pretty it's pretty bleak and almost hopeless, and you're kind of on edge the whole time. The character's kind of on edge, and they're constantly questioning things. And that mystery factor about the beginning of what happened with her husband, what was going on with the person that she apparently killed, it kind of gets intensified as the story continues. So other things start happening, and then you feel like you're just barely following and catching up with everything. But I think that while that meant it demanded your attention, it didn't take away from the emotional connection. I didn't feel like I was constantly trying so hard to keep up that I had no idea what was going on with the main character, her feelings, and how she was processing everything. We're constantly getting everything through her. So because she's on edge, because she's barely keeping up with things, you're barely keeping up with things, but I think it made for a very edgier seat type of pacing, and I ended up reading the entire book in a day. It just flew by for me. There was just always something piquing my curiosity, so anytime that I got to a point where I'm like, okay, we're settling in, this is what's going to be going on, and then something would happen, or something would go wrong, or something would go right, or something new would be presented, and I'm like, oh dang, okay. And so what I was saying earlier about how for a while you're kind of like, where are we going? I don't actually think that was a problem. I was worried about it being a problem for a little bit, but I really enjoyed seeing this character who is somebody who's so powerful, having to kind of claw their way through the story. What I really liked about this is our main character is somebody who's very accustomed to people obeying her. What made this really entertaining is that this character, when I'm saying she's having to kind of claw her way through things, she definitely doesn't think of herself the way that you as the reader can see how she is. So in her mind, she's one way, and it can be kind of frustrating because you're like, miss, you are not this way at all. And then different things will happen that kind of prove, so you thought that about yourself, but I don't think you're quite the way you think you are. But this meant that the story had great character development. So the characters, I would say, a tad frustrating for a lot of the book, or arrogant, or they think that they have had it tough, and they're like, I'm not a pampered princess like all these other people are. And then she'll get into certain circumstances where she was just like, don't you know who I am? Haven't you heard of me? And you're like, no, they haven't, because, you know, they live in this faraway land. And also at the same time, it's like, some of them, maybe if they do know who you are, they still don't care. And it's just really entertaining to see her think that she's all that, and then she's not. You still find yourself rooting for her. You're like, come on, you can get out of this, just use your head. And she does. And sometimes she is temperamental, and sometimes she's really mean, and you're like, oh, I wish you'd been nicer to that character over there, because they seem really nice and I like them. But again, this made for, I think, great character development as the story progressed. However, if you're somebody who you like your characters to be super morally gray, you like them to be villainous, or you like them to be heroes, you might not like this in between, where they're morally gray, but they're also a little annoying. You might not love that. I found it entertaining. With the side characters, I thought the author did a fantastic job of making them stand out, even when they're only introduced for a little bit. And there would be characters that would be introduced and then they would come back later and you instantly knew who they were, because they did such a great job of making them distinct. I don't feel, for the most part, like they felt cartoonish in any sense. I didn't feel like they were overdone. There are a couple of characters. There's one in particular I think you could argue is a little extra, but otherwise I just felt like the characterization was really solid, not just with this main character and the whole unreliable narrator aspect of it, but also I just really enjoyed these side characters. I felt like they had a lot of personality. Despite this, I actually do think that the dialogue is something I might have liked done a little bit differently. The story is kind of cutthroat and intense, and for the most part I would say it has a slightly serious tone to it, but still adventurous, or still fun, I suppose you could say, entertaining at least. But the dialogue to me sometimes felt like it didn't quite fit the tone of the rest of the book. So it sometimes felt a little juvenile, especially from the main character. We do see flashbacks occasionally, and it kind of fits their personality, but I still think based on the rest of the setting and the way that the rest of the story goes about, I would have liked the dialogue to maybe be a little bit more mature. For those of you that love some good action in your fantasy, this is not going to deliver on these huge battles, but it does have a grittiness to it that I think will still be very much your cup of tea. Now for the world building aspects. This is the part of the book that I think is going to make it the most difficult for some people because there is a lot. So this particular land that this queen is ruling over, it clearly was fractured, and there's all these different individuals who want power and are scheming, but because it's not a multiple point of view story, you don't really get that well informed on all of these different things. You definitely see the character speaking with a lot of authority on these things because it's her life, it's something she's familiar with, and she'll have conversations with other people, and you kind of have to pull things from that. She also will think about these things, so you're pulling things from that, but again, it's only from her point of view. I think the information was delivered to us in a good amount of time. When it was necessary for it to come up, it came up, so it felt organic, and I didn't feel overwhelmed at the beginning like it was just a bunch of information all at once. I didn't feel like there was all of a sudden a let's sit down and figure out what's going on with the world type of moment. It came up as it was needed, but there's also a lot to it, and there's clearly different customs from place to place. There's also, I think, an interesting amount of details about the city itself or the infrastructure or those sorts of things that I think sometimes we don't really get in fantasy. So I liked having those details there. But it does mean that it's a lot of information, there's a lot of different names, and there's a lot to the different customs and cultures of these different places. And sometimes I would say I wasn't probably soaking in all of it. I knew enough to understand what I needed to understand for the stakes and for whatever scene I was in. But if you're a really, really big fan of detailed world building, I think you're going to eat this part up. I think you're going to really enjoy it, and I actually think it'll enhance your enjoyment of the story even more than I liked it, but I think you'll like it even more if you're a big world building fan. Also, for those of you that like descriptions of food, there is a lot of that, and that's an example of how the author shows different customs and the culture of different places, because there will be times where the main character, Queen Talion, will think like, most of my people think that this is overly sweetened or something like that, and in her mind she's thinking, but I've always thought it was delicious. Those sorts of things. So I think the world building is done very well. I can't wait to see the world expand, especially because we get hints of dragons in this book, and they're not really there that much, but there's a hint of magic touched on, and we have these different creatures, and this first book is a little bit more contained, but I'm so excited to see how it expands in the sequels. If you have read it, definitely let me know your thoughts. Let everybody else know your thoughts on this. I would love to see other people's opinions. If you haven't read it, I'm very curious if you're now interested, but anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.